Hello and welcome to the Deep Dive by CAP STRAT. Mike, today we're talking politics. Some potentially interesting questions like, who's the president going to be come November? What party is going to control Congress? And based on the answers to those two questions, what could the policy and economic and market implications be? So let's start by setting some expectations around how we determine who the next president is going to be. And just quick glance at this page, you see a lot of red. We're not making any calls at this point, but it does look like leaning Republican for the most part here. Mike, what are these factors that we look at?
We'll go through them one by one. We're going to start with national level polling data. The way we use that, if national polling data is leaning 10% or more in either direction, that is a very good predictor of the popular vote, and in most elections, the result follows the popular vote. So you look at where we're at today, Republicans with a very small lead there, plus 1.7%, clearly not enough to have sufficient margin of safety. The other thing to note is how polls have been coming in since Vice President Harris has become the candidate and consolidated support from the party. Those more recent polls, a lot of them are within the margin of error.
Right.
So you think about where we are now, quite different from where we were post-assassination attempt prior to President Biden dropping out of the race. At that point, that was the sweet spot for Republicans. They were gaining momentum and getting close to 4% margin in terms of polling. So far too close to call. It's almost like the race has been reset. And if you were to say it leans one way or the other, you would have to say at this point, given the information, that it leans Republican, but not a lot of confidence in that.
Sure.
And can definitely change. So what's more useful is polling on the state level, because you need the 270 votes to win, and ultimately it's going to come down to a few swing states deciding the outcome. So here, once again, the quality of the data and the timeliness of the data is very important. Now that we're at a point where we have a completely different candidate for the Democrats, a lot of the state polling data, the last time a lot of these swing states were polled was in the spring. And so we're going to have to wait for that to get updated. Once again, if you had to make a call right now based on the most up-to-date polls in each state, it looks like the Republicans, between the states that look like they're firmly going Republican and are leaning Republican, they have a pretty solid margin of safety there, easily getting the 270. They wouldn't need that many swing states to pull off the election. So with current information, you'd say that one leans Republican as well. Then we get to approval rating. Approval rating, it's not necessarily about the current sitting president and whether they're seeking re-election. It's about the party in power. So what is the approval rating of the incumbent party's candidate, regardless of if they're seeking election? Right now, it's 41.7%. That's Joe Biden's approval rating. So that's more so the populace voting on not only President Joe Biden, but also the party's control over the last 4 years in office.
Sure.
And that is too low. Between now and election night, the Democrats need to get that approval rating up to at least 48% to have any historical precedent of the party being reelected. So a lot of work to do there. That's probably going to have to come from some type of policy announcement or military victory, if that's possible. Some of those things will come up as we talk to the 5 keys, the 13 keys a little later on. Then we look at betting odds. Betting odds, very volatile, but timely. This fully reflects Kamala Harris being the candidate and getting the support of the Democratic Party. You see there, with the most up-to-date information, the Republicans have the margin of safety there, 55.8% versus 43.3%. The other key thing to note here is, are the independent candidates in aggregate going to be significant enough to sway the election in one way or the other?
Right.
They're currently, they're not polling significantly, and they're currently not expected to be if you look at betting odds, almost a rounding error for independent support. So that looks firmly Republican.
Right.
That can change a lot between now and election night. So then we get to the only thing has any shade of blue in it, which is the keys to the White House, Allan Lichtman's keys to the White House. So just a reminder there, Allan Lichtman is a professor who developed a framework for predicting the outcomes of presidential elections, where he has 13 specific keys. It's an objective yes, no. It's all research-based. he assigns the keys to the incumbent party. If the incumbent party wins 8 or more keys, then they win re-election. And he has, over the last 40 years, he's predicted all but one of the presidential election outcomes, and that was in 2000 when Al Gore lost.
Yeah, and you had the popular vote versus the election outcome.
Exactly, while winning the popular vote. So he views elections as a referendum on the past 4 years, not as Americans going to the voting booth and deciding on the next 4 years. And if you go through his keys, he just provided an update now that Kamala Harris is likely the candidate. The Democrats have 6 keys in the bag and 2 likely. And if those 2 go firmly towards the Democrats, then the Democrats would have the 8 keys necessary.
Right.
So this is quite an oddball. What are those 2 keys that are out there, and will they get them? One is no significant third-party candidate. And it appears likely that that will be the case. There will be third-party candidates on the ballot. That's not what the key is about. The key is about a significant candidate that can really steal votes from one of the 2 major party candidates. The last such candidate was Ross Perot. You're thinking about somebody polling in the double digits, 10% range. So that looks like it's going to go towards the Democrats. And the last one that he's withholding judgment on is the social unrest key. The reason why he's withholding judgment there is because in 1968, when the Democratic National Convention was in Chicago, as it is this year, so we had significant protests around the war in Vietnam, and that social unrest was enough to potentially sway the election outcome. So he's waiting for the Democratic National Convention to go off without a hitch before assigning that key to the Democrats. If that happens, then the Democrats would have their 8 keys.
8 keys?
Yeah. So creating a lot of uncertainty here. The final indicator is stock market performance. Since the S&P 500's inception in 1928, in the 3 calendar months prior to Election Day, so the clock starts on August 5th, if the S&P 500 has a positive return, then the incumbent party is reelected. If the S&P 500 return is negative, then the opposing party takes power. And you think about why that is. Could that be different this time around? Because this basically speaks to markets don't like uncertainty. And if there's a change in power in the White House, that could be viewed as uncertainty, and investors could reduce position sizes, trim, hedge, sell, whatever. But in this instance, the Republican candidate is Donald Trump. And there's very little uncertainty there around what his policies would be if he had free reign.
Yeah.
So where's the uncertainty coming from? And then also he's perceived by voters, or at least half of them, to be a market-friendly candidate. So why would the S&P 500 go down in that instance? And we would point to this still being a valid key this year because of a couple things. One, this is just you're heading into a seasonally weak time period anyway for the S&P 500. But 2, just because Donald Trump is the candidate and investors are somewhat certain around that and what that means from a policy standpoint, what he is able to accomplish could be severely limited by the makeup of Congress. If he's only able to accomplish things that the market doesn't like tariffs and stricter immigration, and not able to accomplish things that the market loves, like broader tax cuts, because he doesn't have congressional support, then you could still see the market sell off in advance of election night.
Sure. Yeah. Sure. So Mike, we look at this slide and you see a decent amount of red here. Obviously, the keys leaning Democrat could become firmly Democrat. What are we doing as we sit here today in portfolios to prepare for this election?
If we're going to prepare portfolios, we want to see all of these indicators lining up in one direction with a margin of safety. So we clearly don't have that yet, but it's very early. This is far earlier than we normally talk about elections. If these start to flip, or they all do start to line up, then we'll obviously, do another video update and then talk about how we would position portfolios. But, at this point, for the sake of this video shoot, let's say the data is leaning Republican, because that will impact the scenarios that we can talk about. What's the most likely outcome at this point, given the data?
Yeah, so obviously a lot of uncertainty remaining here, but if we want to talk about most likely outcomes and potential policy implications, we of course need to check in on the congressional elections as well. What we have here are expectations based on consensus forecasts for the Senate and the House. In the Senate, 1/3 of the Senate is up for election this cycle. The numbers are just kind of tough for Democrats to retain their lead in the Senate. As we look at projections here today, Republicans projected to win 50 seats, Democrats projected to win 48, 2 with the toss-up. Vice president would be the tiebreaker there, so a Republican presidency would mean a Republican Senate as well. The real uncertainty coming from the House. The entire House up for election in 2024. Here you can see Republicans and Democrats pretty even from a projection standpoint, with 25 races still being called a toss-up, meaning either party could end up leading the House of Representatives based on projections today. So with that uncertainty coming from the potential outcomes of the congressional elections, we want to talk about how those different outcomes could impact policy, right? So based on the slide you went through talking about the potential for the presidential outcome, we'll focus here on the Republican president column. Mike, what could be different between a Republican sweep or a divided Congress with a Republican administration?
And so we've really simplified the policy mix here into things that President Trump can do sort of on his own.
Yep.
Those are in the arrows, versus things that he would need congressional approval for. So they would be more likely to happen in a sweep scenario. Those are the check marks. Generally speaking, if you're the market, the things that President Trump can pull off on his own are less market-friendly policies. Markets don't like tariffs, and they generally are not in favor of stricter immigration because it limits growth of the labor force and potentially means inflation could be higher for longer. We'll talk about that on the next slide.
Check out the last deep dive for more information on that.
Exactly. So then we get into the things that he would need congressional approval for, and those are the crowd pleasers.
Yeah.
Extending the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, even expanding on that, including corporate tax reductions, and then more spending. Net this mix, yes, there are some tax revenue increases on the tariff side, but they would be scored by the CBO, most likely to be more than offset by less tax revenue from tax cuts and increase in spending. So this is a fiscally stimulative policy mix. And then you see if we go into a divided Congress, what you get is you still get those less market-friendly policies, but fewer of the crowd pleasers.
Right.
If 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act extension for the middle income was put on the table in a divided Congress, that would probably see some bipartisan support.
Yeah. So let's take these ideas and let's translate them into the economic framework, maybe starting with a Republican sweep. Mm-hmm. What would the implications be for these 4 factors?
So for liquidity, thinking about the Fed would do with all of this.
Right.
Those policies aren't going to show up in the data they look at until at least the back half of 2025. So nothing's going to change between now and then. But from that point forward, a fiscal boost from here, from tax cuts and being partially offset by tariffs, that fiscal boost, fiscal stimulus, if the government is pressing on the gas pedal and doing stimulative policies, what that probably means is the Fed is going to not be able to cut as much or to as low of a level, and they might have to keep rates higher for longer. So net, this is less of a positive for liquidity than other outcomes. In terms of inflation, a lot of these policies are inflationary. Tariffs are almost an immediate boost to inflation. It'll be interesting to see how the Fed deals with that. And then if you limit growth of the labor force, that could result in higher wage growth, higher inflation from the labor market over the long term. And then things like tax cuts, those are generally stimulative. If there's more economic activity, you could see how prices could go up there, which leads to economic growth. We're pretty confident that that policy mix would boost nominal GDP growth. The question is how much of that nominal GDP growth would just be increases in the price level, inflation. Versus how much would be real growth. That's a bit of a wild card. It depends on the severity of the tariffs, how limited immigration is, the impacts on the labor force, all of that, and if those tariffs are reciprocated and how negative that could be. So that's a bit of a question mark, but overall, if you think about probability of a recession, with a net fiscal stimulus, especially when the government is already spending this much money, it just makes it harder to go into a recession. So recession probability would be low given that policy mix.
Yeah. And if we do see the Democrats take a House of Congress and we see a divided Congress, the implications here, you're not getting as those friendly legislation measures, right?
Yeah, so you would basically have more of the bad stuff, which would be higher inflation, and then recession risk wouldn't go down as much.
Yeah.
Maybe it would be unchanged. There'd
Sure.
still be a probability there. So if you're the market and you're thinking about trades here, because the markets are going to move before this shows up in the data, what are the big trades?
Yep.
And the market has started to walk towards these, but hasn't really moved towards them in any big way. These are generally strong dollar type
US dollar.
policies. The last time tariffs were enacted during the prior Trump presidency, the dollar did very well. So stronger dollar. If you think about the shape of the yield curve, if there's more fiscal spending and stronger nominal GDP growth in the future, that's probably going to push up longer term interest rates. And if the Fed is able to cut in the next 12 months, what that means is shorter term interest rates come down, longer term goes up. That's a steepener.
Yep.
So you'll see that get played. And then the last part is, this is, it's an American first policy mix. So America first policy mix. So companies that are more domestically focused and source more of their inputs domestically and have pricing power are going to be the winners. Those can be large caps, those can be small caps. Those are generally perceived as small caps because they have a lot more of their revenue coming from domestic sources.
Got it. Yep. Awesome. Well, that will do it for this edition of the Deep Dive. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to reach out.